My mother-in-law handed me a list of reasons to divorce me. I read it aloud. Hey everyone. Before this story unfolds, take a second to like, subscribe and turn on notifications because what you're about to hear is not just a story of humiliation, but a journey of calculated strength, quiet endurance and a comeback that no one saw coming. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where silence speaks louder than screams and patience always wins. This story began on a morning that looked ordinary from the outside. The kind of day that carries no warning signs, no thunder in the distance, no sense that something life-altering is about to land in your hands. The house was quiet, the air heavy with routine, and I was moving through my life the way I had learned to since marrying into a family that never truly wanted me. I had learned to stay small, to stay polite, to stay grateful even when gratitude was undeserved. I had learned that survival sometimes meant silence. My mother-in-law had never hidden her disappointment in me, but she had perfected the art of wrapping cruelty in politeness. Her smiles were thin, her compliments sharp-edged, and her presence always came with the subtle reminder that I was an outsider who had somehow slipped through the cracks. To her, I was not a partner chosen out of love. I was a mistake that could still be corrected. That morning, she arrived unannounced as she often did, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who believed every space belonged to her. There was no warmth in her greeting, only urgency, the kind that signals control rather than concern. She handed me an envelope, thick and heavy as though it carried more than paper inside it. There was no explanation, no pretense of kindness, just the quiet certainty that whatever was written inside would land exactly where she intended. The envelope sat in my hands like a verdict. I could feel the weight of it before I even opened it. It was not anger that rose first, nor fear, but a strange sense of clarity. Some part of me already knew what it contained because people like her never act without purpose. When I unfolded the pages, my suspicion turned into confirmation. It was a list. A long one. Carefully typed, neatly numbered and devastatingly detailed. A list of reasons why I was unworthy of her son. Reasons why my marriage was a failure. Reasons why divorce, according to her, was not just an option but a necessity. Each line cut deeper than the last, not because the words were shocking but because they were familiar. They were the same judgments she had implied for years, now finally given form and structure. The list criticized my background, my career, my personality, my appearance, my supposed lack of ambition, my independence, my refusal to bend into the version of a woman she preferred. It painted me as a liability, a burden, a stain on a family legacy I was never allowed to understand. What struck me most was not the cruelty but the confidence. She had written this believing it would end me. What she did not expect was my calm. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not tear the pages apart. I folded them neatly and placed them back into the envelope. Something shifted inside me in that moment, something quiet but irreversible. Years of swallowing disrespect had taught me restraint, but this was different. This was clarity. The kind that comes when you finally realize that no amount of obedience will ever earn you dignity from those who thrive on your discomfort. Later that day, the family gathered for a small event, one of those obligatory moments where appearances mattered more than truth. The house filled with familiar faces, each carrying their own assumptions about my place among them. I moved through the room with practiced politeness, the envelope tucked safely in my bag, waiting. I was no longer anxious. I was deliberate. When the moment came, it felt almost natural. I stood not with anger but with purpose. The room quieted, more out of surprise than respect. I removed the envelope and unfolded the pages slowly, allowing the weight of anticipation to settle. What happened next was not impulsive. It was intentional. I read the list aloud. Not with emotion, not with trembling hands, but with clarity. Each reason was given the space it demanded. Each judgment was exposed to the light. I did not add commentary. I did not defend myself. I simply allowed her words to exist in the open, exactly as she had written them. The room shifted with every line, the discomfort spreading, the silence growing heavier. By the time I reached the end, the air was thick with realization. What had been intended as a private weapon had become a public mirror. Faces that once looked at me with indifference now carried unease. The power dynamics had changed not because I had raised my voice but because I had refused to hide. I folded the pages again, thanked everyone for listening and returned to my seat. There was no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no visible victory. But something had been set in motion, something that could not be undone. As the evening continued, I watched carefully. I observed the way my mother-in-law avoided eye contact, the way others struggled to reconcile the narrative they had been fed with the reality they had just witnessed. I said very little because I no longer needed to explain myself. That night as I lay awake, I understood that reading the list aloud was not the revenge. It was the opening move. The real reckoning was still to come, and it would not be loud or messy. It would be precise. The days following that evening unfolded with a strange stillness, the kind that follows an earthquake when the ground appears calm but everything beneath has shifted. Nothing was openly addressed, no apologies offered, no explanations demanded. Yet every interaction carried an undercurrent of tension, as though everyone involved was waiting to see who would make the next move. I did not rush to fill the silence. I had learned that silence, when chosen, could be far more unsettling than confrontation. My mother-in-law retreated into a version of politeness that felt rehearsed. Her messages were brief, her presence distant, her authority weakened by exposure. The list she had written with such confidence had returned to her in a form she could not control. She had intended to isolate me, but instead she had revealed herself. That realization lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Within the family, perspectives began to shift in subtle ways. People who had once dismissed my discomfort now approached me with cautious curiosity. They did not apologize, but they observed. They watched the way I carried myself, the way I no longer overextended, the way I no longer sought approval. There is a quiet power in no longer asking to be accepted. What none of them knew was that I had already begun rebuilding something far more important than their perception. I was reclaiming my sense of self. For years, my energy had been spent trying to prove my worth to people who benefited from my insecurity. Now that energy had a new direction. I focused on my independence with renewed intention. Every decision, every routine, every goal was filtered through a simple question. Does this serve my peace or my progress? I invested in my work, sharpened my skills, and strengthened the parts of myself that had been dulled by constant criticism. Growth, I discovered, was the most elegant form of resistance. At home, the dynamic shifted further. My partner noticed the change before anyone else. Not because I announced it, but because I no longer bent myself into smaller shapes to keep others comfortable. I was no longer explaining away disrespect or minimizing my pain. I was present, grounded, and unmoved by passive disapproval. That shift demanded recognition. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law struggled with the loss of narrative control. She had built her authority on being unquestioned, on delivering judgments in private where they could not be challenged. The public reading of her list had disrupted that system. She could no longer pretend her intentions were misunderstood. They had been heard clearly and completely. Attempts were made to regain footing. Invitations were extended with forced warmth. Compliments were offered that arrived too late to feel sincere. But I understood the difference between reconciliation and damage control. I accepted nothing at face value. My kindness remained intact, but my boundaries were firm. What made this phase powerful was not confrontation but consistency. I did not waver. I did not seek revenge through humiliation or gossip. I let my composure do the work. People began to notice that I was no longer reactive. The absence of reaction unsettled those who expected me to crumble or lash out. Behind the scenes, I prepared quietly. I organized my finances, documented interactions, and strengthened my support network outside the family. Not out of fear but out of foresight. Strength is not just emotional, it is practical. I understood that true security came from being prepared for any outcome. As weeks passed, the family dynamic recalibrated itself around this new reality. I was no longer the easy target, the silent recipient of criticism. I had become unpredictable not because I was volatile, but because I was no longer transparent in my vulnerability. That uncertainty shifted the balance of power. The list, once meant to end my marriage, had instead marked the beginning of my autonomy. It had forced everything into the open where manipulation struggled to survive. And while no one spoke of it anymore, its presence lingered, a reminder that words, once exposed, cannot be reclaimed. I knew then that the final outcome would not be decided by a single dramatic moment. It would be shaped by time, by consistency, by the quiet accumulation of self-respect. The real revenge was not in proving her wrong, but in no longer needing her validation at all. As I moved forward, one truth became clear. This story was no longer about being rejected. It was about choosing myself fully and unapologetically. And the consequences of that choice were just beginning to reveal themselves. The shift was no longer subtle. What started as discomfort had evolved into something far more dangerous for those who relied on control. Uncertainty. The family system that once ran smoothly on hierarchy and silence now struggled to recalibrate around a variable it could no longer predict. I was no longer pliable. I was no longer eager to please. And most unsettling of all, I was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. My mother-in-law sensed this loss of control deeply. People like her are experts at reading power dynamics, and she knew instinctively when the balance tilts. The list had been her strongest move, a final attempt to assert dominance under the assumption that I would collapse, retreat, or quietly disappear. Instead, I had done something far more threatening. I had survived with dignity. Her behavior shifted again, this time toward subtle correction. She began framing herself as misunderstood, as overly concerned, as someone whose intentions had been twisted by sensitivity. The narrative softened, but the agenda remained the same. What she wanted was restoration of authority, not reconciliation. She wanted to rewrite the story without acknowledging the harm. But stories lose their power when the audience changes. Within the family, conversations began to happen without her at the center. Relatives who had once echoed her opinions now hesitated. They had heard the list. They had felt the discomfort of its cruelty. And even if they did not openly challenge her, they could no longer unhear it. The illusion of moral superiority had cracked. I watched this quietly, carefully. I did not intervene or attempt to sway anyone. Influence gained through silence often lasts longer than influence gained through persuasion. I let people draw their own conclusions because conclusions reached independently are harder to undo. At the same time, my internal world continued to strengthen. I no longer woke up bracing myself for criticism. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head. The anxiety that once followed me like a shadow began to fade, replaced by a steady sense of self-trust. I had crossed an invisible line, one where my worth was no longer negotiable. This inner shift reflected outwardly in ways I hadn't anticipated. My posture changed. My tone became firmer. My decisions carried confidence. I stopped asking for permission in spaces where I already belonged. That kind of change is unsettling to those who benefited from your self-doubt. My mother-in-law responded the only way she knew how: escalation disguised as concern. She questioned my choices indirectly, raised doubts about my priorities, and attempted to plant seeds of worry under the guise of family interest. But what she failed to realize was that I was no longer fertile ground for manipulation. The seeds found no soil. What made this phase critical was restraint. It would have been easy to confront her, to expose every tactic, to demand accountability. But I understood something now that I hadn't before. Confrontation gives manipulators a stage. Detachment takes the spotlight away entirely. Instead, I focused on building a life that did not revolve around their approval. I expanded my professional opportunities, strengthened friendships outside the family, and invested in passions I had once postponed. Each step forward reduced their influence over my emotional landscape. The most telling change came in how others treated me. Invitations were extended directly, not filtered through her. Opinions were sought. My presence was acknowledged rather than tolerated. These were small shifts, but together they formed a pattern. I was no longer invisible. For my mother-in-law, this was unbearable. Her identity was deeply tied to being the axis around which the family turned. Losing that position meant confronting her own insecurity, something she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Rather than reflect, she tightened her grip, attempting to reassert relevance through subtle exclusion and selective communication. But exclusion only works when someone fears being left out. I no longer did. There was a moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, that confirmed everything for me. I realized I had gone an entire week without thinking about her opinion. No anxiety. No anticipation. No emotional rehearsal. Just peace. That was the moment I knew the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer reacting to her. She was reacting to me. This reversal did not bring celebration or satisfaction. It brought clarity. I understood now that the true cost of control is isolation. As she clung tighter to her version of authority, she pushed others further away. Her influence diminished not because she was challenged but because she was no longer needed. Meanwhile, my life expanded into spaces she could not access. Spaces built on mutual respect rather than fear. Spaces where my voice was not an inconvenience but a contribution. That expansion was the quietest form of victory. By the end of this chapter, the list no longer haunted me. It had transformed into a symbol of the moment everything changed. What was meant to define my failure had instead marked my awakening. I did not need her approval to thrive. And she could feel that truth settling in. It would be about consequences. The tension no longer lived in the open. It had retreated into quieter spaces, into unanswered messages, missed gatherings, and conversations that suddenly stopped when certain names were mentioned. This was no longer about confrontation. This was about consequence. And consequences, unlike revenge, do not announce themselves. They arrive softly, settle in slowly, and stay longer than anyone expects. My mother-in-law was experiencing something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling: irrelevance. Not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual. The kind that creeps in unnoticed until one day it becomes undeniable. Her opinions were no longer requested before decisions were made. Her approval was no longer sought as validation. Family plans moved forward without consulting her first. She was still present but no longer central. For someone who had built her identity around authority, this was a quiet collapse. She attempted at first to ignore it. Denial is often the first refuge of those losing power. She maintained her routines, her expectations, her tone. But the responses she received were different now. Polite, distant, efficient. The warmth she once commanded had cooled into formality. The fear that once ensured compliance had faded into indifference. Indifference, I learned, is far more devastating than anger. I did nothing to accelerate this process. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't discuss it. I simply continued living the way I had chosen to live since the day I read that list aloud. With clarity. With boundaries. With a refusal to shrink. I showed up when I wanted to, withdrew when I needed to, and spoke only when my words served a purpose. The contrast between who I was and who I had been became increasingly visible. I was no longer the accommodating presence quietly absorbing discomfort. I was grounded, decisive, and self-assured. And people respond differently to someone who knows their worth without demanding recognition for it. My partner's role in this shift became more pronounced as well. Without dramatic declarations or confrontations, loyalty revealed itself through consistency. Support showed up in actions rather than words. The space that once allowed interference slowly closed, not because of argument but because it was no longer available. This boundary, once established, became self-reinforcing. My mother-in-law sensed the change acutely. She tried once more to reinsert herself through concern. Questions framed as worry. Suggestions disguised as guidance. But these attempts landed flat. They were met with neutrality, not resistance. And neutrality leaves no room for manipulation to thrive. What she failed to understand was that her greatest weapon had always been emotional access. Once that access was revoked, she was left with nothing but noise. And noise is easy to ignore. The family, too, adjusted. Without the familiar gravity pulling them into old patterns, new dynamics emerged. Conversations grew more honest. Interactions became less performative. The unspoken permission to question authority quietly spread. It wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. And in that evolution I found something unexpected. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning, but from no longer fighting battles that were never meant to be mine. I stopped measuring my progress against her expectations. I stopped revisiting moments of injustice. I stopped needing closure from someone incapable of accountability. Closure, I realized, is not something others give you. It is something you claim when you stop waiting. There was a moment, months after the list had been read aloud, when I saw her watching me from across a room. Not with anger. Not with contempt. But with confusion. She no longer knew who I was, and worse, she no longer knew how to affect me. The familiar strategies failed. The predictable reactions were gone. In that moment I understood the full weight of what had happened. The power she once held was never truly hers. It had been borrowed from my compliance. Once I reclaimed that, everything else followed naturally. Her influence continued to fade, not because she was punished but because she refused to adapt. Control only survives when it evolves. Hers did not. And so it dissolved. As for me, I had crossed into a different phase of life. One where my energy was spent creating rather than defending. One where my worth was assumed, not debated. One where respect was not requested but expected. It did not end with confrontation or confession. It ended with distance. And sometimes, distance is the most honest resolution of all. The story, however, was not finished yet. Because the final chapter was not about her downfall. It was about my rise. The story had moved beyond conflict. What once felt heavy with tension now felt light with certainty. The list that had been handed to me with the intention of breaking my marriage, my spirit, and my sense of worth had lost its power entirely. It no longer defined the past, and it certainly had no place in my future. What remained was something far more enduring than revenge. Transformation. I had become someone unrecognizable to the version of myself who once tried endlessly to earn approval. The woman who had read that list aloud was not driven by courage in the traditional sense, but by exhaustion with injustice. The woman who stood now was driven by purpose. That difference mattered. My life no longer revolved around reacting to disrespect. It revolved around intention. Every decision I made was rooted in clarity rather than fear. I chose where to invest my time, my energy, and my emotions with care. I no longer tolerated environments that demanded my silence in exchange for belonging. I understood now that belonging should never require self-erasure. The family dynamic had stabilized into something quieter and more honest. My mother-in-law existed on the periphery, no longer the authority she once believed herself to be. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no emotional speeches, no acknowledgments of wrongdoing. And strangely, none of that was necessary. The absence of her control spoke louder than any apology ever could. She watched from a distance as my life expanded beyond her reach. As my confidence solidified. As my independence became undeniable. There was no celebration in her eyes, only the realization that the narrative she had tried to impose had failed. The future she had planned for me without my consent no longer existed. What mattered most was that I no longer needed her to see that. My marriage, once threatened by external interference, found a new foundation. One built on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and quiet loyalty. The space that once allowed manipulation had been closed permanently. Not with force but with consistency. Trust grew stronger where interference had weakened it before. Professionally, I stepped into opportunities one had once hesitated to claim. I stopped downplaying my achievements. I stopped apologizing for ambition. I allowed myself to be visible without guilt. Success, when pursued authentically, does not need validation from those who doubted you. It speaks for itself. Socially, my circle shifted as well. Relationships rooted in obligation faded, replaced by connections built on respect and understanding. I learned that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Selectivity is not cruelty. It is self-respect. There was a moment, quiet and ordinary, that defined the true ending of this story. I realized I could no longer remember the exact wording of the list. The reasons blurred together, no longer sharp or memorable. What once felt like a weapon had become irrelevant. Forgotten not because it was forgiven but because it no longer mattered. That is when I understood the final truth. The greatest revenge was never reading the list aloud. It was becoming someone the list no longer applied to. Not because I changed to prove her wrong but because I changed to honor myself. I did not rise by tearing anyone down. I rose by refusing to stay small. I rose by choosing peace over permission. I rose by understanding that dignity is not granted by families, titles, or approval. It is claimed the moment you decide you will no longer negotiate your worth. My mother-in-law lost power not because she was defeated, but because her influence expired. Control has an expiration date when it is built on fear. Once fear is gone, there is nothing left to hold it up. And as for me, I stepped fully into my life without looking back. Without bitterness. Without the need for acknowledgement. My story was no longer about survival. It was about sovereignty. So if there is one lesson this story leaves behind, it is this. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has nothing left to prove. Because when they rise, they do not seek revenge. They simply outgrow the room. And that is the kind of ending no one can take away.